The auctioneer's hammer fell with the weight of a coffin nail, and Serafina Duskmore's life was sold for the price of a horseshoe. 1 silver coin. The fat man's voice boomed across the dusty town square of Redemption Gulch, his tobacco-stained teeth gleaming in the harsh afternoon sun. Going once, going twice. The crowd of weathered miners and desperate drifters shifted like vultures around Carrion, their eyes drinking in the sight of the young woman standing on the makeshift platform. Serafina's midnight hair hung entangled, waves around her shoulders, her cornflower blue dress torn at the hem and stained with the dust of 100 miles of walking. But her spine remained straight as a rifle barrel, and her green eyes burned with a defiance that made grown men look away. She'd walked into this godforsaken town 3 days ago with nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart full of desperate hope. Now she stood like merchandise, her father's gambling debts having followed her even here, to the edge of civilization. Sold to the gentleman in black. Serafina's gaze snapped to the back of the crowd, where a figure stood apart from the others, tall and lean as a shadow at noon. The stranger wore dusty black from his wide-brimmed hat to his worn leather boots. A silver star caught the sunlight on his vest, a deputy's badge. She realized with a mixture of relief and confusion. The crowd began to disperse, disappointed murmurs floating on the hot wind. Most had expected the pretty bride to go for at least $10, maybe 20. 1 silver coin was barely enough for a shot of rot-gut whiskey. As the stranger approached the platform, Serafina noticed the way he moved, fluid and purposeful, like a predator who never wasted motion. His face remained hidden beneath the shadow of his hat brim, but she caught glimpses of a strong jaw and lips pressed into a hard line. "Ma'am." His voice was rough as desert sand, barely above a whisper. He extended a gloved hand to help her down from the platform. Serafina hesitated. In the span of 5 minutes, she'd gone from free woman to what exactly? Property? Wife? The auctioneer had been vague about the specifics, and she'd been too proud to ask for clarification when the bidding started. "I ain't gonna hurt you," the deputy said, his hand still extended. "Name's Riven Hollowglen." Something in his tone, not gentle, exactly, but steady as bedrock, made her decision. She placed her trembling fingers in his gloved palm and stepped down from the platform. His grip was surprisingly warm through the leather. "Serafina," she managed, her voice hoarse from 3 days of dust and desperation. Serafina Duskmore. Riven touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement, but said nothing more. He led her through the thinning crowd toward a hitching post where a magnificent black stallion waited, stamping impatiently at the packed earth. "Where are we going?" Serafina asked as Riven untied the horse's reins. "My place. Few miles outside town." His words were economical, each one carefully chosen. "You'll be safe there." Safe. The word hit her like cool water after a long drought. When was the last time she'd felt truly safe? Not since her father had lost their farm in a poker game back in Missouri. Not since she'd been forced to flee in the dead of night with nothing but her mother's wedding dress and a faded daguerreotype of parents who'd died too young. Riven swung up into the saddle with easy grace, then extended his hand again. "Can you ride?" "Well enough." Serafina gathered her skirts and accepted his help up behind him. The moment she settled against his back, she felt the coiled strength in his frame, the careful control of a man accustomed to violence but determined to avoid it. They rode in silence through the dusty streets of Redemption Gulch, past the saloon, where piano music tinkled through the batwing doors, past the general store where women in faded calico watched their passage with curious eyes. Serafina felt their stares like pinpricks against her skin. By tomorrow, everyone in town would know about the desperate bride who sold herself for a silver coin. The horses' hooves drummed against the hard-packed earth as they left the town behind, following a narrow trail that wound between scrub brush and weathered rocks. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the whisper of wind through sage and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Serafina studied the back of Riven's neck, where dark hair curled against his collar. A thin white scar ran from his left ear down to disappear beneath his shirt. Another scar crossed his right knuckles, visible where his glove had pulled back. This was a man who'd seen violence, probably dealt it out in equal measure. Yet he'd bought her freedom for a single silver coin. "What?" "Mr. Hollowglen," she began. then stopped when she felt him tense slightly. "Just Riven," he said without turning around. "Riven, then. I need to know, what exactly do you expect from me? What does that silver coin buy you?" For a long moment, the only answer was the steady rhythm of hoofbeats. Then Riven spoke, his words carried away by the wind almost as soon as they left his lips. "Time," he said simply. "It buys us time." Before Serafina could ask what he meant, a gunshot cracked across the desert like thunder, and Riven's body went rigid in the saddle. But in the blood-red dust cloud rising behind them, 3 riders were gaining fast, and the glint of steel in their hands promised that time might be the one thing they didn't have. To Riven's hand moved to his Colt like lightning, the weapon clearing leather before Serafina could draw breath. His stallion, trained for combat, didn't even flinch at the distant gunfire. "Hold tight," he growled, spurring the horse into a gallop. Serafina wrapped her arms around his lean waist, feeling the play of muscle beneath his shirt as he guided their mount with one hand while keeping his gun ready with the other. The desert landscape blurred past them, red rocks and twisted mesquite, patches of sage that released their sharp scent as the horse's hooves crushed them. Another shot rang out, closer this time. Serafina risked a glance over her shoulder and saw them clearly now. 3 riders in brown dusters, their faces hidden beneath pulled low hat brims. The lead rider held a rifle, and even at this distance, she could see the predatory way he sat. His saddle. "Who are they?" she shouted over the thunder of hoofbeats. "Trouble," Riven replied without turning. "The kind that follows a man whether he wants it or not." They crested a low ridge, and suddenly Riven was pulling the stallion to a sliding halt behind a cluster of boulders. He dismounted in one fluid motion, pulling Serafina down with him. "Stay down," he ordered, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "No matter what happens, you keep your head below these rocks." Serafina crouched in the red dust, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. "Riven, what's this about? Why are they chasing us?" For the first time since she'd met him, Riven looked directly at her. His eyes were the color of winter sky, pale blue and cold as mountain snow. But in their depths, she glimpsed something else, a pain so deep it made her breath catch. "Your father," he said simply. "Ezra Duskmore, owed more than gambling debts when he died." The words hit her like a physical blow. "My father's been dead 2 years." "Dead, yes. But his debts." Riven checked his cylinder, counting bullets with practiced efficiency. "Some debts don't die with a man. Some get passed down like a family curse." The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder. Riven moved to the edge of their rocky shelter, his movements cat-quiet despite his size. Serafina found herself studying the line of his shoulders, the careful way he positioned himself to shield her from the approaching riders. "Hello, Glenn," a voice called across the desert, rough and mocking. "We know you're there, deputy. And we know you got something that belongs to Malric Vexmore." Serafina's blood turned to ice water. She knew that name. Every soul west of the Mississippi knew Malric Vexmore. The outlaw controlled half the territory between here and California, his gang leaving a trail of burned homesteads and unmarked graves wherever they rode. "Something?" Riven called back, his voice steady despite the odds. "Or someone." A harsh laugh echoed off the rocks. "Same difference to Vexmore. The girl's father made a deal. 20,000 in gold, or his daughter pays the debt. You can't change a man's word with a silver coin, lawman. $20,000. Serafina's head spun with the impossibility of it. Her father had been a small-time farmer who'd never seen that much money in his entire life. What kind of deal had he made? "The auction was legal," Riven replied. "Witnessed by half the town. She's under my protection now." "Your protection?" The voice was closer now, maybe 50 yards. 3 against 1, deputy. And we ain't particular about badges out here." Riven glanced back at Serafina, and she saw something shift in his expression, a decision being made, a line being crossed. "There's something else you should know," he said quietly, his words meant for her alone. "About why I bid on you." Before she could respond, the first rider appeared around the edge of their shelter. Riven's colt barked once, and the man toppled from his saddle with a strangled cry. But even as his body hit the ground, the other 2 were charging, their guns blazing. Serafina pressed herself against the rocks as bullets whined overhead, showering her with stone chips. The acrid smell of gunpowder filled her nostrils, mixing with the metallic taste of fear on her tongue. Riven moved like a man possessed, rolling from cover to cover, his gun speaking with deadly precision. But she could see the mathematics of it, 2 against 1, and they had him pinned down. Sooner or later, they'd work around to flank him. That's when she saw it, a fallen rider's rifle, lying just a few feet from her hiding place. Her father might have been a gambling fool, but he'd taught her to shoot straight before he'd taught her anything else. Serafina, no, Riven shouted as she broke from cover, but she was already moving, diving for the rifle as bullets kicked up dust around her feet. Her fingers closed around the stock just as one of Vexmore's men rounded the rocks, his gun trained on Riven's exposed back. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and the outlaw spun sideways, clutching his arm. It wasn't a killing shot, but it was enough to save Riven's life. The last rider, seeing his companion wounded and his advantage lost, spurred his horse hard and disappeared into the maze of rocks and ravines that scored the desert landscape. Silence fell like a curtain, broken only by the wheeze of the wounded man's breathing and the nervous stamping of their horses. Riven holstered his gun and walked over to where Serafina still knelt in the dust, the rifle trembling in her hands. His shadow fell across her, and when she looked up, his expression was unreadable. "You could have been killed," he said finally. "So could you." She struggled to her feet, brushing dust from her skirts with hands that wouldn't quite stop shaking. "Besides, I couldn't just hide while you fought my battles." Something flickered in those winter-pale eyes, surprise, perhaps, or approval. "Most women would have." "I'm not most women." The words came out sharper than she'd intended, carrying the weight of every compromise she'd refused to make, every easy path she'd turned away from. "And I still don't understand why you bought me. You said it wasn't about the money, so what was it about?" Riven glanced at the wounded outlaw, who was slowly crawling toward his horse, leaving a trail of blood in the dust. Then he looked back at Serafina, and she saw him making another decision, whether to trust her with the truth. "Your father didn't just owe Vexmore money," he said finally. "He promised him something else. Something Vexmore's been hunting for 3 years. "What?" "Information. About a gold shipment that never made it to California. 20 bars of pure gold, stolen from a government transport." Riven's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Your father was one of the thieves." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Serafina reached out blindly, her hand finding the sun-warmed surface of a boulder. Her father a thief? A man who'd partnered with the most dangerous outlaw in the territory. "That's impossible," she whispered. "My father was many things, but he wasn't a criminal." "Maybe not by choice," Riven said gently. "Maybe Vexmore had something on him, forced his hand. But the gold's still out there somewhere, and Vexmore thinks you know where it is. But I don't. I never even saw my father in his final months. He was too ashamed to come home after he lost the farm." Riven studied her face with those penetrating eyes, and she had the feeling he could see straight through to her soul. "I believe you," he said finally. "But believing you and convincing Vexmore are 2 different things entirely." The wounded outlaw had managed to haul himself onto his horse and was riding away, swaying in the saddle but still upright. In a few hours, he'd be back at Vexmore's camp, reporting that the deputy had the girl and wasn't planning to give her up without a fight. "So what happens now?" Serafina asked. "Do we run? Try to reach the territorial marshal?" Riven shook his head. "Vexmore owns half the lawmen between here and Denver, and running just makes us easier targets in open country." He walked over to their horse, checking the animal for injuries from their wild ride. "No, we go to ground. I know a place where we can hole up, figure out our next move. And after that," Riven swung up into the saddle and extended his hand to her. As she settled behind him again, she felt the solid warmth of his back against her chest, the steady rhythm of his breathing. "After that," he said, "we find that gold. It's the only thing that'll buy your freedom from Vexmore's claim." As they rode deeper into the wilderness, following trails that seemed to exist only in Riven's memory, Serafina found herself wondering about the man who'd bought her for a silver coin. There were layers to him, depths she was only beginning to glimpse, and the way he'd looked at her when she'd picked up that rifle. But ahead of them, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, and in the distance, the mournful howl of a coyote reminded them both that in this harsh land, survival was never guaranteed, and trust was a luxury that could cost them everything. The hidden canyon lay like a secret wound in the earth, its red walls rising straight up toward a sky the color of faded denim. A thin stream wound through its heart, flanked by cottonwoods that whispered ancient secrets in the evening breeze. To Serafina, it felt like stepping into another world, one where time moved differently and the outside world's troubles couldn't follow it. Riven's cabin sat in a grove of trees near the water, built from weathered pine logs that had aged to silver gray. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, and yellow lamplight glowed warm in the windows. "Someone's here," Serafina observed, tension creeping into her voice. "Friend," Riven said simply, dismounting and helping her down. "Or as close to one as a man like me gets." The door opened before they reached it, revealing a woman who made Serafina's breath catch. She was perhaps 30, with auburn hair braided down her back and green eyes that missed nothing. Her simple brown dress couldn't hide her natural grace, and there was something about the way she carried herself, like a queen in exile, dignity wrapped around her like armor. "Riven," the woman said, her voice carrying a slight accent Serafina couldn't place. "I was beginning to worry." "Isolde," Riven touched his hat brim. "This is Serafina Duskmore." "Serafina, meet Isolde Nightshade." Isolde's gaze swept over Serafina, with frank assessment, taking in the torn dress, the dust-streaked face, the way she unconsciously stood closer to Riven than propriety demanded. Something flickered in those green eyes, not jealousy exactly, but a deep, abiding sadness. "Come inside," Isolde said finally. "You both look like you've been riding hard." The cabin's interior was sparse but comfortable. A stone fireplace, handmade furniture worn smooth by use, shelves lined with books that spoke of an educated mind. But it was the small details that caught Serafina's attention: a woman's shawl, draped over a chair, delicate china cups on the mantel, the lingering scent of lavender soap. "I'll make coffee," Isolde said, moving toward the kitchen with the easy familiarity of someone who belonged here. Serafina watched her go, then turned to find Riven standing by the window, his shoulders rigid with tension. "She lives here," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. Sometimes, Riven's reflection in the glass looked haunted. "When she needs a place to hide." "Hide from what?" Before he could answer, Isolde returned with a tray bearing 3 steaming cups and a plate of cornbread that made Serafina's empty stomach clench with hunger. They sat around the small table, and for a few minutes, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the whisper of wind through the canyon walls. "Vexmore's men found us," Riven told Isolde finally. 3 of them, armed and looking for trouble. Isolde's cup paused halfway to her lips. "How many made it back to tell the tale?" "1, wounded but breathing." "Then he knows where you're headed. This place won't be safe much longer." Isolde set down her cup with deliberate care. "You should have brought her to me directly, instead of playing the gallant hero at that ridiculous auction." Serafina looked between them, sensing undercurrents she didn't understand. "You knew about the auction?" "I knew about everything," Isolde said, her accent becoming more pronounced. "Your father's debts, Vexmore's claim on you, even Riven's foolish plan to buy your freedom." She shot Riven a look that could have melted steel. What I didn't know was that he'd put himself directly in harm's way to do it. The pieces began clicking together in Serafina's mind, forming a picture she didn't like. "You two planned this. The silver coin, the timely rescue, it was all arranged." Riven's jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. Isolde, however, leaned forward with something like pity in her eyes. "Child, you have no idea how deep these waters run. Your father didn't just steal gold from the government. He stole it from Malric Vexmore himself. 20 bars that Vexmore had already stolen from a union payroll train." Serafina's head was spinning. "Then why doesn't Vexmore just take the loss and move on?" "Because it wasn't just about the gold," Isolde continued. "Those bars were marked with specific serial numbers. Numbers that could hang Vexmore and half his gang if they fell into the wrong hands. Your father didn't just steal treasure. He stole evidence." "But I told you, I don't know where." "We know you don't," Riven interrupted, speaking for the first time since they'd sat down. "But there's something you need to understand about why I really bought you today." He reached into his vest and pulled out a folded paper, yellowed with age. When he spread it on the table, Serafina saw it was a letter written in her father's familiar scrawling hand. Riven, it began, if you're reading this, then I'm dead and my sins have caught up with me at last. I know I have no right to ask anything of you, not after what happened to Sarah. But my daughter is innocent in all this. When Vexmore comes for her, and he will, I pray you'll remember that some debts can only be paid in blood, while others can only be forgiven. The gold is where we said our goodbyes. She'll know the place when she sees it, your friend and brother in grief. Ezra Duskmore. Seraphina stared at the letter, her father's words blurring as tears she refused to shed gathered in her eyes. Sarah, she whispered. Who was Sarah? The silence that followed was deafening. Riven's face had gone pale as winter moonlight, and Isolde reached across the table to cover his hand with hers, a gesture of comfort born from shared sorrow. My wife, Riven said finally, his voice barely audible. Sarah was my wife. The world tilted again, but this time Seraphina felt like she was falling into an abyss. She died 3 years ago, Isolde said gently, killed by Vexmore's men, when they came looking for the gold your father had hidden. She was with child. The cup slipped from Seraphina's nerveless fingers, shattering on the wooden floor. Coffee spread like spilled blood across the planks, and she found herself staring at it, unable to process what she'd just heard. Your father was there, Riven continued, each word seeming to cost him dearly. He tried to stop them, but there were too many. After they killed her, he helped me bury her. Swore an oath that he'd make things right somehow. And you've been hunting Vexmore ever since, Seraphina breathed. We both have, Isolde said quietly, in our own ways. Seraphina looked at her with new understanding. You're not just a friend hiding here. You're hunting them too. Isolde smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Malric Vexmore killed my husband when I refused to tell him where I'd hidden certain documents. Documents that could bring down his entire operation. Since then, I've made it my life's work to be a thorn in his side. The cabin felt smaller suddenly, filled with ghosts and old pain. Seraphina stood abruptly, needing air, needing space to think. She walked to the window and stared out at the canyon walls, now purple with approaching dusk. So this was never about saving me, she said without turning around. This was about revenge, about using me as bait to draw Vexmore out. No, Riven's voice was behind her now, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body. It started that way. I won't lie to you about that. But somewhere between the auction block and that gunfight today, things changed. She turned to face him, and what she saw in his eyes made her breath catch. The careful control was still there, but underneath it burned something raw and honest, something that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with the way she'd picked up that rifle to save his life. Your father's letter mentions a place where they said goodbye, Isolde said from the table. Do you know what he meant? Seraphina closed her eyes, thinking back to the last time she'd seen her father. It had been at her mother's grave, 2 weeks before he'd lost the farm. He'd knelt there for hours, talking to the headstone like she could hear him. When he'd finally stood, there had been tears on his cheeks and a look in his eyes like a man making peace with his demons. Mama's grave, she whispered. Back in Missouri. He used to say that's where he'd left his heart, where he'd said goodbye to everything good in his life. Riven and Isolde exchanged a look loaded with meaning. That's 1,000 miles from here, Riven said, and Vexmore will be watching every road between here and there. Then we'd better start moving, Isolde said, rising from the table with sudden purpose. Because that wounded man will be back with reinforcements by morning, and this canyon will become a trap instead of a sanctuary. Outside, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, a sound, both lonely and defiant. But as Seraphina looked at Riven's scarred hands loading bullets into his gun, she wondered if they were riding toward salvation or simply trading one kind of death for another. They rode through the night like demons fleeing judgment, 3 shadows against the star-scattered darkness. Isolde had traded her simple dress for men's clothing, worn leather pants, a heavy coat, and boots that had seen 1,000 miles of hard country. She rode her bay mare with the easy grace of someone born to the saddle, keeping pace with Riven's stallion without apparent effort. The plan was simple in its desperation. Reach the railroad depot at Bitter Creek before dawn, catch the eastbound freight, and pray that Vexmore's men couldn't follow a speeding train. From there, It would be 3 days hard riding to reach the cemetery where Ezra Duskmore had hidden his stolen redemption. But plans, Seraphina was learning, were fragile things in this harsh country. The first sign of trouble came as they crested a ridge overlooking the depot. Below them, the small cluster of buildings sat dark and silent beside the gleaming rails, but there were too many horses tied at the hitching posts, too many shapes moving in the shadows. They beat us here, Riven said grimly, pulling out a brass spyglass. Vexmore must have split his forces, sent riders ahead to cut off our escape routes. Seraphina counted at least a dozen men positioned around the depot, their rifles glinting. In the moonlight, how did they know we'd come here? Because it's what I would do, Isolde said quietly. The railroad is the fastest way east, and Vexmore knows we're running out of time. Every hour we delay gives him more opportunities to set traps. Riven lowered the spyglass, his jaw set in hard lines. There's another way. The old mining road through Devil's Canyon. It'll add 2 days to our journey, but 2 days we don't have, Isolde interrupted. By now, Vexmore will have sent word ahead to every outlaw camp between here and Missouri. The longer we take, the more men he can position between us and that cemetery. A freight train's whistle echoed across the desert, still miles away but growing closer. The eastbound train that represented their best hope of reaching Missouri before Vexmore's net closed completely around them. Seraphina studied the depot below, her mind racing through possibilities. What if we don't try to avoid them? Both Riven and Isolde turned to stare at her. Think about it, she continued, warming to the idea even as it terrified her. They're expecting us to run, to find another way around. What if we give them what they think they want? You're talking about surrender, Riven said flatly. I'm talking about deception. Seraphina's green eyes gleamed with a fierce light that reminded both her companions of her father's gambling instincts. Vexmore wants me alive because he thinks I know where the gold is hidden. So we let him take me, let him think he's won. And while he's focused on making me talk, we hit him from behind. Isolde finished, understanding dawning in her voice. It's crazy enough that it might work. It's crazy enough to get you killed, Riven said sharply. You don't know what kind of man Vexmore is, what he's capable of. I know he murdered your wife and child, Seraphina replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. I know he's been hunting me like an animal ever since my father died. And I know that running will only delay the inevitable. She met his pale blue eyes without flinching. Besides, I won't be alone. You'll come for me. The train whistle sounded again, closer now. They could see its headlight cutting through the darkness like a fallen star. There's no time to plan this properly, Riven said, but Seraphina could hear the reluctant acceptance in his voice. Sometimes the best plans are the simplest ones, Isolde said. She pulled a small derringer from her coat and pressed it into Seraphina's hand. 2 shots. Make them count. Seraphina felt the weight of the tiny gun, warm from Isolde's body heat. How will you know when to move? When the shooting starts, Riven said grimly. It always comes down to shooting in the end. They separated at the base of the ridge. Riven and Isolde melted into the shadows on either side of the depot, positioning themselves with the patience of predators. Seraphina rode straight down the main trail, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. The first outlaw to spot her let out a whistle of surprise. Well, I'll be damned. The little dove just flew right into our cage. Men emerged from their hiding places, rifles trained on her as she rode into the circle of lamplight outside the depot building. Seraphina counted 13 of them, hard-faced. Men with the kind of scars that spoke of violent lives lived at the edge of civilization. And in the center of them all stood Malric Vexmore himself. He was not what she'd expected. Instead of a grizzled outlaw, she found herself facing a man of perhaps 40, well-dressed in a dark suit that wouldn't have looked out of place in a Denver bank. His silver hair was neatly trimmed, his mustache waxed to sharp points. Only his eyes betrayed his true nature, pale gray and utterly without mercy. Miss Duskmore, he said, his voice cultured and smooth. How thoughtful of you to save us the trouble of hunting you down. Mr. Vexmore. Seraphina dismounted slowly, keeping her hands visible. The derringer felt heavy as lead in the hidden pocket of her skirt. I believe you have some business with me. Indeed I do. Vexmore approached her with the casual confidence of a man accustomed to having others fear him. Your father stole something that belonged to me. something I'm quite eager to recover. The gold, Serafina said simply. The gold. Vexmore smiled, but there was no warmth in it. 20 bars of pure federal gold, along with certain documentation that could prove embarrassing to me if it fell into the wrong hands. Your father promised to tell me where he'd hidden them before he died. Unfortunately, he was inconsiderate enough to succumb to his illness before fulfilling that promise. The train whistle was very close now, perhaps a mile away. Serafina could hear the rumble of its approach, feel the vibration through the soles of her boots. And you think I know where he hid it? I think your father was a sentimental fool who would have told his precious daughter where to find his last gift to the world. Vexmore's gray eyes studied her face with clinical interest. Even if he didn't tell you directly, he would have left clues. Fathers always do. What if I don't know anything? What if you're wrong? Vexmore's smile widened, revealing teeth like polished bone. Then you'll have ample time to search your memory while my men provide encouragement. I find that pain has a wonderful way of clarifying one's recollections. The freight train rounded the bend, its headlights sweeping across the depot like a lighthouse beam. Steam hissed from its brakes as it began to slow for the water stopped. That's when Serafina saw him. Riven moved like a ghost made flesh, emerging from the shadows behind two of Vexmore's men. His knife took the first one silently. A hand clamped over the outlaw's mouth as the blade found his heart. The second man barely had time to turn before Riven's gun barrel cracked against his skull, dropping him to the dirt without a sound. But 13 men were too many, even for someone with Riven's skills. The odds were impossible, the outcome inevitable. Unless you want to know where the gold is, Serafina said loudly, drawing every eye back to her. I'll tell you, but not here, not with all these witnesses. Vexmore raised an eyebrow. Witnesses? My dear girl, these men work for me. Their loyalty is absolute. Is it? Serafina pulled the derringer from her pocket, not pointing it at anyone, but making sure it was visible. Because the way I hear it, you've been promising them shares of that gold for 3 years now. How long before they start wondering if you ever intend to pay up? She saw several of the outlaws exchange glances, doubt flickering in their eyes. Vexmore's smooth facade cracked slightly, his jaw tightening with anger. You're stalling, he said coldly. I'm negotiating. Serafina raised the derringer, pointing it directly at her own temple. One wrong move from any of your men, and you'll never find that gold. Dead women tell no tales, Mr. Vexmore. The train was almost at the platform now, its brakes shrieking against steel wheels. In the chaos of noise and steam, more of Vexmore's men began to fall, silently, efficiently, as Riven and Isolde worked their deadly craft in the shadows. But time was running out. Soon, even Vexmore would notice that his forces were dwindling. Very well, the outlaw leader said finally. You and I will board that train. Alone. You can tell me about the gold during our journey east. Just the two of us. Just the two of us. Vexmore's smile returned, cold as winter starlight. After all, where could you possibly run on a moving train? The freight train shuddered to a halt, steam billowing from its stack like dragon's breath. The engineer leaned out of his cab, shouting something about a 5-minute water stop. That's when everything went to hell. One of Vexmore's men, turning to check the perimeter, found his partner's body sprawled behind a stack of freight crates. His shout of alarm cut through the night like a blade, and suddenly everyone was moving at once. Serafina threw herself sideways as gunfire erupted around the depot. Vexmore dove for cover behind a water barrel, his cultured demeanor forgotten. As he clawed for his weapon, the remaining outlaws scattered, seeking shelter behind anything that might stop a bullet. Riven appeared at Serafina's side, as if materializing from smoke, his strong hands pulling her toward the train. Move, he shouted over the gunfire. The cattle car threw back. They ran through a hell of muzzle flashes and screaming lead, the air around them thick with gunpowder smoke. Behind them, Isolde's rifle cracked with metronomic precision, each shot finding its mark with deadly accuracy. The cattle car's door stood open, a rectangle of darkness that promised sanctuary. Riven boosted Serafina up into the car, then turned to provide covering fire as Isolde sprinted toward them. She made it 10 yards before Vexmore's bullet took her in the shoulder, spinning her around and sending her to her knees in the dirt. Isolde, Serafina screamed, The auburn-haired woman looked up at them, blood streaming down her arm, and smiled with fierce pride. "Go," she shouted. "Find that gold and finish this." The train whistle shrieked again, and the great iron beast began to move, slowly at first, but gaining momentum with each passing second. Riven made a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his days. He grabbed Serafina around the waist and pulled her back from the door as she tried to jump down to help Isolde. "We can't leave her." Serafina fought against his grip, tears streaming down her face. "She knew the risks," Riven said quietly, his own voice thick with emotion. "And she chose to give us this chance. Don't let her sacrifice be for nothing." As the train picked up speed, carrying them away from the depot and deeper into the night, Serafina caught one last glimpse of the battle below. Isolde had made it to cover behind the water tower, her rifle still spitting defiance at Vexmoor's men. But even as the depot disappeared into the darkness behind them, Serafina could hear the thunder of hoofbeats on hard ground. And she knew that Malric Vexmoor was not the kind of man to let a train carry away his prize without a fight. The cemetery lay beneath a blanket of fresh Missouri snow, white headstones emerging from the drifts like broken teeth. Serafina knelt beside her mother's grave, her breath forming small clouds in the bitter air as she traced the familiar inscription. With trembling fingers, "Eleanor Duskmore, beloved wife and mother, her heart blooms eternal." 3 days had passed since their escape from the depot. 3 days of riding freight trains east, switching cars at midnight stops, always looking over their shoulders for signs of pursuit. They'd reached the small town of Cedar Falls just as the first snow began to fall, and now, in the gray light of dawn, they faced the moment of truth. "Nothing looks disturbed," Riven observed, scanning the cemetery with the careful eyes of a man who'd learned to read danger in every shadow. His rifle lay across his knees, ready for the trouble they both knew was coming. Serafina closed her eyes, remembering that last conversation with her father. He'd stood right here, she was certain of it, with tears on his weathered cheeks and words that had seemed like rambling at the time. "Your mama always said this ground was sacred," he'd whispered to the headstone. "Said the roses she planted here would bloom forever if we just had faith. Even in the darkest winter, there's always something growing underneath." At the time, Serafina had thought it was just grief talking. Now, "The roses," she breathed, looking at the withered stems that marked her mother's grave. He said her roses would bloom forever. Riven set down his rifle and began brushing snow away from the base of the headstone. His fingers, surprisingly gentle for their size, cleared the frozen earth until he found what they were looking for: a small metal box, wrapped in oiled cloth and buried just deep enough to escape casual notice. Inside the box, along with 20 gleaming gold bars, they found a leather portfolio filled with documents. Shipping manifests, telegraph records, even photographs, enough evidence to hang Malric Vexmoor and half his gang twice over. "Your father was smarter than any of us gave him credit for," Riven said quietly, studying the meticulous records. "He didn't just steal the gold, he documented everything. Names, dates, amounts. This could bring down Vexmoor's entire operation." Serafina lifted one of the gold bars, feeling its surprising weight. $20,000 in her hands, enough to buy a new life anywhere she chose. But as she looked at Riven's scarred face, she realized that all the gold in the world couldn't purchase what she truly wanted. "It's over then," she said. "We can take this to the territorial marshal. Let the law handle Vexmoor." "Can we?" Riven's winter-pale eyes were fixed on something behind her. "Because I'm afraid the law just arrived." Serafina turned to see riders. Emerging from the tree line, a dozen men in long coats, their badges glinting in the weak sunlight. But something was wrong with the picture. These lawmen moved too carefully, their hands too close to their guns. "Federal marshals," the leader called out as they approached. "You folks need to step away from whatever you found there." Riven's hand drifted toward his Colt. "Funny thing about federal marshals," he said quietly to Serafina. "They usually travel in pairs, not dozens. And they don't usually have wanted posters folded in their saddlebags." That's when Serafina saw him, Malric Vexmoor himself, riding among the fake lawmen with a satisfied smile on his cultured face. He'd found them after all, and this time he'd brought enough men to ensure there would be no escape. "Miss Duskmore." Vexmore called out as the riders formed a circle around the cemetery. How thoughtful of you to do all the digging for us. I trust you found what we've all been looking for. I found it, Serafina replied, her voice steadier than she felt. The question is, what happens now? Vexmore dismounted with theatrical grace, straightening his coat as if he were attending a social function rather than a confrontation in a graveyard. Now, my dear, you're going to hand over that gold and those documents. In exchange, I'll make your death quick and relatively painless. Generous of you, Riven said dryly, his hand now resting openly on his gun butt. What about the territorial marshal? What about justice? Justice? Vexmore laughed, the sound echoing off the headstones like the cry of a carrion bird. Justice is whatever the man with the most guns says it is. And as you can see, I brought quite a few guns today. That's when Serafina made a choice that surprised them all. Instead of backing away or reaching for her hidden derringer, she stepped forward, closer to Vexmore. You're right, she said simply. You have all the guns. You have all the power. You've won. Riven's sharp intake of breath was audible, but Serafina continued without looking at him. But before I give you what you want, she said to Vexmore, I want to know something. Why did you really kill Riven's wife? The gold was already hidden by then. She couldn't have told you anything useful. Vexmore's smile faltered slightly. She was in the way. Sometimes innocent people get hurt. When she was pregnant, Serafina interrupted, her voice cutting through his excuse like a blade. You killed an innocent woman and her unborn child. Not for gold, not for information. Just because you could. Your point, Miss Duskmore. Serafina smiled then, and it was her father's smile, the one he'd worn when he'd held 4 aces in a high-stakes game. My point is that some things are worth more than gold. She tossed the leather portfolio high into the air, documents scattering like autumn leaves in the wind. As Vexmore's men instinctively looked up, tracking the falling papers, Riven moved with the fluid grace of a striking snake. His first shot took Vexmore in the chest, the outlaw leader's eyes widening with shock as he stumbled backward. His second and third shots dropped the nearest gunman before they could clear leather. But 12 men were still too many, even with surprise on their side. Gunfire erupted around the cemetery, bullets chipping marble angels and splintering wooden crosses. Serafina dove behind her mother's headstone, clutching the box of gold. Bars as lead whined overhead. That's when she heard it. The thunder of approaching hoofbeats, coming fast from the north. Real federal marshals this time, drawn by the gunfire, their authentic badges catching the winter sunlight. It's over, Vexmore, one of them shouted. You're surrounded. The battle in the cemetery became a 3-way fight, Vexmore's surviving. Men caught between Riven's deadly accuracy and the marshals' overwhelming numbers. It lasted perhaps 5 minutes, though to Serafina it felt like hours. When the gunsmoke finally cleared, Maverick Vexmore lay dying in the snow beside Eleanor Duskmore's grave, his expensive suit stained crimson. He looked up at Serafina with fading eyes. The gold, he whispered. We'll buy a lot of good things, Serafina replied quietly. Schools for children who need them. Food for families going hungry. Maybe even a new life for a deputy who's carried too much pain for too long. Vexmore's laugh was a wet, rattling sound. You think that makes you better than me? No, Serafina said simply. It just makes me different. The outlaw leader's eyes went glassy, and Maverick Vexmore breathed his last in the shadow of a headstone, surrounded by the snow-covered roses that bloomed eternal in Eleanor. Duskmore's memory point 3 months later, the wedding was a simple affair, held in the same cemetery where it had all ended. Serafina wore her mother's white dress, carefully mended and cleaned until it looked new again. Riven stood beside her in a black suit that made his pale eyes seem even brighter, his scarred hands gentle as he placed a simple gold band on her finger. Isolde Nightshade stood as matron of honor, her left arm still weak from the bullet wound, but her smile radiant with joy. She'd survived the battle at the depot, been rescued by the real federal marshals, and had spent her recovery time helping Serafina plan this moment. You may kiss the bride, the preacher said, and when Riven's lips met hers, Serafina tasted redemption and new beginnings. They'd used half the gold to establish a school for orphaned children, the kind of place where young people could learn to read and write instead of learning to steal and kill. The other half had bought them a small ranch near the Colorado border, where they could raise horses and children and watch the sun set over mountains that promised endless possibilities. They stood beside Eleanor Duskmore's grave, now marked. With a new rosebush that would bloom come spring, Seraphina thought about the strange path that had brought them here. A desperate auction, a silver coin, and a man who'd bought her freedom with blood and tears. No regrets? Riven asked quietly, his arm warm around her waist. Seraphina smiled up at him. This silent cowboy who'd paid the highest price for love and found it was worth every scar. Only one, she said. What's that? That it took us so long to get here. They rode away from the cemetery as husband and wife, their horses' hooves drumming against the hard ground like a heartbeat full of hope. Behind them, snow began to fall again, covering the grave where Eleanor Duskmore rested beneath roses that would indeed bloom eternal. Nourished now by the tears of joy her daughter had shed and the blood of the man who'd finally found his way home. In the distance, a church bell rang out across the Missouri hills, its bronze voice carrying a message of love and second chances to anyone with ears to hear. If this tale of love found in the hardest of places stirred something in your heart, I'd be much obliged if you'd tip your hat with a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. After all, the best stories are the ones we tell together. Speaking of together, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from today. Whether you're in the wide open spaces of Montana or the bustling streets of New York, we'd love to hear from fellow travelers on this journey.